Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on the 2015 Corporate Accountability Index. My name is Doug Morrow, and I'm the Associate Director of Thematic Research here at Sustainalytics Toronto office, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator for today's session. We're delighted that so many of you can join us today, and I'd like to extend a special note of welcome to those that are joining us for the first time. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with what we are, Sustainalytics is a leading global provider of ESG and corporate governance ratings and research, and we support many of the world's leading asset owners and managers with this research so they integrate it into their investment process. Ranking Digital Rights, the founder of the Corporate Accountability Index, is a nonprofit research initiative housed at New America's Open Technology Institute in Washington, D.C. The organization works with an international network of partners to promote greater respect for freedom of expression and privacy by focusing on the policies and practices of companies in the information communications technology, or ICT, sector. I'm joined today by Rebecca MacKinnon, the project director at Ranking Digital Rights, and Matthew Barg, our in-house senior analyst at Sustainalytics. By way of a brief introduction, in addition to serving as the project director of the Ranking Digital Rights project, Rebecca is also the author of Consent of the Networked, the Worldwide Struggle for Internet Freedom, and co-founder of the citizen media network Global Voices Online. She serves on the board of directors of the Committee to Protect Journalists and was a founding member of the Global Network Initiative. She's held fellowships at Harvard's Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy, the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, the Open Society Fellowship, and Princeton's Center for Information Technology Policy. Rebecca has also served as an assistant professor at the University of Hong Kong's Journalism and Media Studies Center. Matt Barg analyzes the ESG performance of companies in the tech and telecom sectors here at Sustainalytics and played a lead role in co-developing the methodology that was used for the Corporate Accountability Index. And he also supported the company engagement efforts, which we'll hear a little bit about later. Now today, Rebecca and Matt will share their perspective on the index and highlight some of the key messages for investors and other stakeholders. The presentation will take approximately 40 minutes and will be followed by what I hope will be a lively Q&A session thereafter. Now, before I begin, I'd like to highlight some basic housekeeping issues. You're currently all muted, and you will remain muted for the duration of the webinar, just in order to minimize any noise disturbance. But we certainly invite you to send any questions you have about the report, or the index rather, through the interactive box that you see at the bottom of the screen, here highlighted with the number 1. Now, if you have any audio problems during the course of the webinar, please do inform us through the interactive box. And you can also minimize this interactive panel by clicking on the arrow at the top of the panel indicated here by the number 2. Now, finally, we're recording this webinar, and we can make a copy available to all participants in the coming days. So with that introduction and housekeeping issues, with those issues behind us, we can begin the interview segment of today's presentation. And Rebecca, perhaps I can start with you. And I thought, just by way of background, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the history of the Corporate Accountability Index and maybe some of the motivating factors that led you to initiate the project.
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Doug, and it's really great to be here and have an opportunity to present about the Corporate Accountability Index. And just by way of background, you're now seeing the beginning of a slide that really kind of helps to explain why we're doing this project, what it has to do with human rights, what it has to do with business and human rights, and therefore why it would be relevant to investors who are concerned about business and human rights. So in the internet age today, we're increasingly dependent for pretty much every aspect of our lives on internet and mobile devices, right? And so the way in which companies configure their technologies, the way in which our internet service providers determine what you can and cannot do on their services, the way in which internet platforms, social media services, email services, the way in which the decisions they make about security, the decisions they make about what data is collected, with whom it's shared, what you are and are not allowed to do or say on their platforms, increasingly shapes our lives and the lives of people around us and our society. And so this is an area where companies are in fact responsible for what's, you know, for people's human rights ultimately. These companies increasingly also mediate our relationship with governments, and as you know, increasingly, you know, without Facebook and Twitter, it's hard for people to get elected. But also these services also affect what governments know about what we're doing, and as well as our discourse, and you know how we're informed about what's happening in our society and our civic lives, how we can organize, and what is known about us, and so on. So just our entire systems of governance increasingly are shaped by these technologies and therefore have huge human rights implications. And I wrote about all of these issues in my book, Consent of the Network, that Doug mentioned. But the impetus of this project was really to take a very concrete look at what are the specific policies and practices of specific companies when it comes to respecting our human rights to freedom of expression and privacy, and how do we compare what companies are doing, how are we comparing their levels of commitments to rights, and you know, what are they doing specifically to demonstrate that they are maximizing their efforts to respect technology users' rights online. So just very quickly, and then Doug will also talk to Matt a little bit, and then we can get more into the key findings. But with the index, this is our inaugural index. We were able to look at 16 companies, 8 internet companies and 8 telecommunications companies. The internet companies, Google, Yahoo, Microsoft, Twitter, and Facebook, are amongst the most powerful internet platforms that are affecting people all over the world. We also, because this is not just meant to look at American companies but really meant to be global, we looked at the biggest Russian internet platform that includes not only email but also social media. We looked at China's biggest internet platform and a Korean internet platform. And then we looked at a distributed group of the world's largest, 8 of the world's largest telecommunications companies. And we then evaluated them according to 3 different categories of commitment, freedom of expression, and privacy. And I'll get into the findings after Matt speaks a little bit more about investor, sort of why this is interesting to investors. But I also, just in terms of, in case you want to poke around on the website while we're talking, you can go to rankingdigitalrights.org. You can just go to the main site and then click on Corporate Accountability Index, or you can just go to rankingdigitalrights.org/index 2015, and you'll see there's a menu further down under the gray bar where you can download the report. You can look at the individual indicators, so you can go onto a page where you can look at all the different questions we asked, and you can click on each question to find out exactly how each company did on each question, what are the sub-questions that went into each question. So you can go onto the index. It's all freely available online. This is meant to be a tool not only for investors but also for policymakers and for advocates that are seeking to influence companies to better respect users' rights. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Doug.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and we certainly do look forward to hearing more about the findings and key takeaways of the index. But I wondered if I could turn to Matt for a second. And as Rebecca alluded to, it's clear that investors are paying more and more attention to these sorts of issues. So I thought I could get you to talk a little bit about your perspective on why these issues are important to investors?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Happy to. So I think Rebecca, in her intro, really provided a great frame for this question. And I think it's an obvious point, at least to us, that human rights are a key area of concern for responsible investors, whether it be from a values-based approach or to manage reputational risk. Sustainalytics framework has always looked at company performance on a number of diverse issues customized to sectors, and human rights and data privacy and security have always been reflected in our reports as key issues for the sectors that have been investigated here in the index, being telecom and internet services. So privacy and freedom of expression are increasingly relevant to companies operating in these sectors. And one of the things that's driving that is the increasing and progressive sort of digitization of our lives, and the fact that those digital images are increasingly held by corporate entities. The global trend is to share more information and to generate more data. So I can name the trends, I'm sure you all know of them. Mobile computing, the Internet of Things, social media, there's big initiatives to connect the next billion people. So all of this is driving the trend to have data online. So it's very easy to love the potential of all this technology, but we need to also remember that there are some inherent risks, and we need to make sure we're asking questions like whose rights or even safety is put at risk when companies hold extensive digital portfolios on individuals. And investors expect companies to manage this growing materiality. We've seen companies suffer reputational damage and sometimes indirect and indirect financial losses because of their perceived or real complicity in government violations of human rights. And even where the impacts have been less severe, we've seen financial penalties. We also think that mismanagement of these issues could adversely affect customer loyalty, which is a real threat to long-term performance of telecom and tech companies. So beyond just that real responsibility of companies to respect these rights, we also see a material imperative as well. We got that for now.
Yeah. That's great, Matt. Thank you very much. It's certainly interesting because it seems the upside of big data is more frequently discussed and analyzed by investors than the potential downside. So it's interesting to hear that perspective. And maybe building off of that, Rebecca, if I could turn back to you for a moment, and I think really they'd be interested in hearing what some of the key takeaways and main findings were from the index this year.
Sure, absolutely. So as you'll see from the screen I'm showing here now, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that some of the companies complained we were tough graders. The company that got the highest score, Google, and this is, again, our methodology is based on public disclosure, and so it's based on companies' disclosed commitments, policies, and practices. Google discloses the most policies and practices and commitments, and demonstrates publicly the most effort to meet those commitments in the internet cohort. In the telecommunications cohort, Vodafone is at the top, but as you'll see, the highest ranking company is, if you're grading according to sort of university standards, the highest grade is a D, and then it sort of goes down from there. So there's a great deal of room for improvement. The red line here is really the 30% mark. So we felt that companies that received a score of over 30% were demonstrating meaningful efforts to both make commitments and institute policies and practices to fulfill those commitments, at least in some areas, around users' freedom of expression and privacy, and that the companies below 30% were really not showing meaningful effort. And this is how it breaks down overall. But as I'll talk about later on in the webinar, as you poke into the individual questions, the scores and the order of company scores can vary a lot. So it's important to look at kind of specific questions that on issues that you happen to be concerned about and how particular companies are doing. in terms of key issues in the commitment section, what did we look at? We looked at institutional leadership. Is there a CEO commitment? Is there a clear company policy to protect and respect users' freedom of expression and privacy? Is there any evidence of governance and oversight on these issues? At what level? At the board level, executive level, management level? Is there any implementation of any evidence of implementation in terms of staff training, internal whistleblowing mechanisms? Does the company conduct human rights impact assessment that include freedom of expression and privacy in those assessments? And to what extent are those assessments really comprehensive, regular? Is there evidence that they've been independently assured? Stakeholder engagement, grievance and remedy, and I'll talk a little bit later about some of the interesting and somewhat surprising findings there. And so this is how the overall commitment section broke down, and what was interesting is that the companies that scored at the front end of the commitment section are either members of the Global Network Initiative, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative through which companies make commitments to freedom of expression and privacy principles, or the telecommunications industry dialogue, where a number of telecommunications companies have committed to some principles that are built on the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. And so it does seem that those, particularly when it comes to commitment and evidence of overarching commitments, the membership in those organizations is making a difference. On freedom of expression, this has to do with, is content being blocked, taken down? Not that companies shouldn't be policing content. There's been a lot of discussion in the news about, concerns about bad people doing bad things on social media and the need to police that. So it's less about that there shouldn't be rules and more about, are the rules accountable and being enforced in a way that's consistent with human rights and freedom of expression norms. So are the rules clear? Are the enforcement process clearly explained? Are users notified about what's happening? Is there transparency about when governments are making requests of companies to take down content, to block content, to deactivate accounts? Is there transparency about how companies are responding to those requests, how they process them? Is there due process? Is there transparency about private requests they're receiving to take down and restrict content? And is there any accountability around terms of service enforcement? Because that's another growing issue. Or is content just being sort of blocked and censored or not in a fairly arbitrary way? So this is more about accountability than it is about, whether it's a free-for-all or not. And the breakdown, this is the overarching set of scores, and I'll go into some of the details later. But what's very interesting is that a Korean company, Kakao, actually came in number 2 in terms of transparency around its policies and practices around its content controls, and that as you'll see the breakdown here, there are a lot of companies that do not provide a lot of information beyond just what is forbidden. Basically, the companies towards the end are really, they disclose what they forbid, but they don't disclose much else about how they're handling requests. In the privacy category, key issues involve, are the privacy policies clear and accessible? There were a couple of companies in the index that actually don't make their privacy policies public to people who are not registered account holders. Handling of user information, what is collected? How long is our user information retained? With whom is it shared? Under what circumstances? Is this clearly communicated to users? Transparency about requests. Again, governments are asking companies for a lot of information about users and about their activities and movements and location. To what extent are companies providing information about how they handle government requests or any other requests they receive, and are they providing any data about the volume and nature of requests and the percent that they're responding to, and then also security. What are the basic standards of security that these companies are adhering to? Are they using encryption? Are they educating users about threats to their accounts, and so on? So that's kind of the range of issues on the privacy category. Overall, among all the indicators, again, Google came out first, but only just by a little bit, and this is how it played out. And one thing that's quite interesting here, if you look at the array of scores, is that the two European Union-based companies in the index did not score as highly as we thought they might, given the strength of your European data protection law, and that has to do in part with the fact that while European companies are compliant with the law, they don't necessarily always communicate clearly with the users or with the public about the details of that compliance, and actually some of the American companies are communicating more details about particularly about how they're handling government requests for user information. So that's sort of an interesting finding there. And now I go back to Doug and Matt.
Thank you, Rebecca. You've certainly touched on some fascinating issues, and I think it's clear these issues are going to become increasingly important for these companies and other stakeholders going forward. And again, I mean, clearly the index was built from a diverse stakeholder perspective, but again, focusing in on the investor angle, Matt, if I can turn back to you, I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on how investors could possibly use the findings from the index, or even some of the key issues that investors should be mindful of when unpackaging company performance in the study.
Yeah, good question. So like I said earlier, there are high-level trends that are driving increased exposure to these digital rights issues in the ICT sector, and I think as well as other sectors in our economy. So one of the things we're watching is the way it drives reputational risk. In terms of reputation, there are several stakeholders alongside investors that companies should pay attention to. The obvious ones are consumers, governments, and civil society. We want to see that companies are working to make sure consumers are happy to use the products and services, that they trust the companies that are offering these products and services. Business practices should be in line with laws and standards to protect against that situation where a negative event or a severe controversy sort of prompts a regulatory change that could impact business, business strategy or business practice. And finally, I think it's a known fact at the moment, but civil society is a way better friend than it is an enemy. So violations and wrongdoing and even lagging on best practice will get highlighted. And I think there are a lot of groups out there that want to see companies performing well on this, and so there's a lot of expertise and partnerships that can be useful. So with that sort of background, enter the Corporate Accountability Index. There are a few places investors can start with the index and the methodology. Obviously, the first one is review the data we presented and consider how it's relevant to your investment universes. But another key use of the methodology, especially considering the first edition considers a smaller subset of the ICT sector, is to use it as an assessment and engagement tool. A methodology that underpins this project is publicly available, and I think that offers a really big value, especially because of the level of thinking alongside a strong collaborative development approach that went into the criteria. So there's a high level of confidence that these really represent substantive indicators to provide a picture of respect for freedom of expression and privacy. And that was sort of a fundamental focus of the project, to make sure that investors and other stakeholders are empowered to use this themselves, to dig into companies that have not been assessed for the index yet. Otherwise, I think Rebecca did pretty well to highlight how overall company performance still leaves room for improvement. We'd like to see investors looking beyond the overall score to pick at the specifics to make sure the company is nimble in understanding their exposures and are being prepared for the challenges. So that obviously takes a lot of forms, but a couple that I like to highlight are risk assessments, whether it's a human rights risk impact assessment or privacy impact assessment or some other name that could be given to how the company is looking into its business activities, its products and service offerings, and geographical operations to identify what they're exposed to and what those exposures are. You can ask them whether executive or senior management has direct oversight of the issue. I mean, data and brand are major assets, ones that can be damaged by security breaches or connection to human rights violations, and you want to see that there's a strong governance structure to addressing that risk. And of course, kind of the key word in a lot of the work we do is transparency. So what is the company saying publicly about these issues? I think it's valuable to create an expectation of transparency, being clear, reasonable, and appropriate disclosure to enable the investor world as well as other stakeholders to be able to make decisions. And a strength of the criteria that we built here is the expectation it sets specific to freedom of expression and privacy at various levels in the company, including the group, operating, and service levels. So we really push for a focus on that clear and meaningful commitments that can be used by end users and other stakeholders alike. Back to you, Doug.
Good. Thank you, Matt. And maybe while I have you, I mean, building off some of your comments about the methodology for the index, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, the company engagement process. How did that play out for you guys?
Yeah, I think said simply, it was extremely interesting. Company engagement is a pretty core component of the work we do at Sustainalytics, and it was comparably valued here in the Corporate Accountability Index project. And additionally, I think this is a key aspect of the project that the index is intended to contribute to the dialogue among stakeholders on what disclosure should look like and what it can look like. So the company engagement process was really an extension of this intention. I think we were successful in having some pretty open conversations with high-level participants at many of the covered companies. And that's a recognition both of the fact that engagement is an important practice for investors to make sure that they're receiving the information they need to make decisions, as well as a key practice that companies are now using to show their stakeholders that they grasp the growing materiality of these issues. So the details of our outreach was to give every company included in the Corporate Accountability Index the chance to provide feedback on the draft research. So after we had done our primary collection and did some review of that, we sent out the draft profiles to all of the companies. And that was intended to give them a chance to provide additional insights and sources for us to consider. What I want to emphasize here is that the research and the scores you're seeing relied specifically on public disclosure, so that the feedback that we received needed to point to something publicly available in order to impact the score. We took some of the other commentary and built that into some of the narrative parts of the report and the recommendations and whatnot, but the numbers themselves rely on public disclosure specifically. And that decision was taken as the methodology set out to provide a clear assessment of the quality of disclosure as considered by a broad stakeholder audience and with the end user as a main focal point. So maybe a quick note, we also ran a pilot project in 2014 that generated a lot of feedback on the research and methodology on top, and Rebecca's been doing this work for several years, and engagement has always been a strong part of what she's been doing with her network. So I think that engagement piece has been core, and we're trying to contribute something to a dialogue between all of the relevant stakeholders.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. Maybe picking up again on the findings theme, Rebecca, if I can turn back to you for a moment and maybe ask for a slightly different perspective. Did anything surprise you in terms of the findings from this year's index, and then maybe as a follow-up, or a corollary, are there any areas where you would like to see improvements, particular areas of improvement in companies' performance?
Sure. Yeah. Well, there's definitely a lot of areas for improvement, and just to point to a few of the findings on some of a few specific indicators that I think people will find especially interesting. So if you take our commitment section, and we had a question in that section on impact assessment, human rights impact assessment, and there were sort of a series of sub-questions that you can read on the website that added up to the score for this indicator. Yahoo got the top score in terms of its disclosed breadth and thoroughness of its impact assessment process. And you'll see that Google and Microsoft were sort of similar, and Facebook's score was affected largely because their disclosure did not make clear whether their impact assessment also covered other services they own, like Instagram and WhatsApp, that you know, are used by many hundreds of millions of people all over the world, and so therefore are very relevant to their responsibility to human rights. So if their disclosure is clarified in the future, that score might come up. But what's very interesting is that Twitter, which you know, in many ways, their CEO Jack Dorsey has said a lot of things about his commitment to freedom of expression and rights of users. They show no evidence of conducting any kind of human rights impact assessment process whatsoever. And Twitter did not do so well in general on the commitment section in terms of demonstrating kind of oversight and specific measures to ensure accountability on freedom of expression and privacy. So that's, I think, an interesting finding that might surprise a number of people. Also, another very interesting finding relates in the freedom of expression section to the process of responding to requests. So what this means in the freedom of expression section, you know, a number of the questions had to do with, okay, we recognize that companies are getting requests from governments and in many cases also from private parties, whether it relates to copyright takedowns or whether it relates to defamation lawsuits or whether it relates to, you know, people reporting abuse on terms of service. And so to what extent do the companies disclose anything about their process for handling requests to restrict content? And a few of the companies disclose quite a bit of information. Some companies disclose, you know, some information, but not as much as they could, and many companies, including Orange, which is a European company, you know, it's not headquartered in a repressive regime or a developing country. They disclose nothing. So that's a very interesting finding there. On the privacy side, in terms of what was interesting, on the indicator that's asking, does the company disclose what user information it collects, how it collects that information, and why, you know, just very clearly disclosing what's being collected about us if we're using their service. Kakao, a Korean company, actually had the most clear disclosure, followed by Facebook, which has been under quite a bit of pressure in recent years to be more clear about what they collect about people. And so actually their disclosure was pretty good. And then a whole cluster of companies, including a Chinese company, kind of got the same score in 60%, and then it kind of went down from there. And there's a couple of companies, you know, an Indian company and a Russian company that are, you know, disclosing the least. But the order of company scores was in some cases surprising here. Particularly, you know, when you look at Orange, they only got 40% score, and given the emphasis on data protection and privacy in Europe, that was a bit surprising about their level of disclosure. Also, when it comes to disclosure about sharing of user information, so in terms of disclosing clearly if and how the company shares user information with third parties. And we were clear that user information doesn't just mean your name and your address or the content of your communications, but also sort of your location, your IP address, what they call metadata that can be used to construct a profile about you and your activities. That is included in our definition. And while disclosure was across the board, inadequate, the highest scoring companies only got around 50%. Very interestingly, Google, which got the top score in the index overall, scored extremely poorly on this particular indicator. So again, this is where looking at the specific questions and looking at the range of companies and is very interesting. And you see a Chinese internet company actually did better than I think a lot of people would have expected, in at least in disclosing if and how it shares user information with third parties. Which is, it shares a lot, but it's at least being clear in its disclosure about what it's doing. So that's interesting. And again, Vodafone and Orange, despite the strong emphasis in Europe on privacy and data protection, disclosing a lot less than people might assume they would in comparison with some of the other companies. And so our recommendations for companies are similar to some of the things Matthew was talking about. We need companies to carry out risk assessments. This is really important to demonstrate that they're actually taking users' rights seriously and assessing risks and seeking to mitigate them. We need transparency, not only about how companies are handling government requests, either to take down content or hand over content, but also how they're handling private requests and how they're enforcing their terms of service, which is particularly the case when it comes to content and freedom of expression issues, a real concern. Companies need to communicate more clearly about what's happening to users' information. They are not doing an adequate job across the board. Grievance and remedy mechanisms, extremely important if we're going to bolster trust in platforms, and very obviously evidence of strong security practices is absolutely essential. And so many things that companies need to improve upon, but I think the good news is that within the indicators, the roadmap for what companies need to be doing is also laid out fairly clearly. So we're hoping, especially since companies can, or anybody, investors, any stakeholders can go to the website and download the raw data and download exactly what information we used to compile the scores, and therefore what was lacking for each indicator, and why the requirements for each indicator and each sub-question of element of every indicator, why that wasn't met. It should provide a fairly clear roadmap for companies to improve, and also for stakeholders to hold very specific conversations with companies about what they're doing well and what they're not doing so well, and in particular in cases where some companies are pointing the way towards best practice, why, what's preventing a given company from meeting that best practice.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Definitely some interesting findings there, and thought-provoking recommendations as well. And it'll certainly be interesting to see how company performance changes over time on these issues. And I am conscious of time here. We are approaching 40 minutes, so I think we should conclude the interview segment of the presentation and switch to the Q&A component. So with that, I would again invite listeners to submit questions using the question interface of the webinar. A few questions have already come up, so perhaps while we're collating questions, I can answer these. And we are getting some questions on the methodology. So Rebecca, maybe I can turn this to you. And in particular, there's some interest in figuring out how you guys picked the specific companies. In other words, your starting universe of companies. How did you arrive at those companies? For instance, we noticed Amazon is not included, or Alibaba. So just wondering if you can comment a little bit on that aspect of the methodology.
Yeah, I mean, it was really tough because our resources were limited and we could only have 16 companies, and we decided we needed to do an even split between 8 internet and 8 telecommunications companies. We wanted to have a broad geographic distribution. So, you know, you add one company, you have to subtract another. And Amazon, you know, I would say, I would love to have included Amazon, but we also, just in terms of the global reach, and we were interested as well in looking at some of the internet companies that are members of the Global Network Initiative and contrasting them with those that are not. Amazon did not make it in, basically because we felt that, you know, if we put Amazon in, we'd have to take one of the other companies out, and we weren't sure, you know, again, the justification for doing that. We had to make a lot of really hard decisions. Alibaba, you know, I would say we could only have one Chinese company. It was between Tencent, Alibaba, and Baidu. All of those 3 companies are, you know, globally listed. And we ended up deciding to include Tencent because its services are more comparable to the services of the other internet companies in the mix. And I agree, if we have Amazon, we would want to have Alibaba as well because their services are more comparable. But yeah, and we also kind of were not looking so much at shopping platforms, which was, you know, I mean, these companies have a lot of content and kind of speech-related services as well, where people are communicating and expressing themselves. So Amazon and Alibaba, you know, would certainly be candidates for the future. But in our FAQ, in our frequently asked questions section of the website, we get into this a bit. You know, we get a lot of questions about why, you know, fill in the blank company wasn't included. And it's, you know, I really wish we had more resources to have included more companies in this first round, but we had to make some really hard choices.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. That does help shed light on the methodology. Matt, if I can turn to you for a second, and we're getting a few questions here about some company examples, because you mentioned in your presentation that you've seen evidence that some companies have faced financial penalties, or in some cases, you know, reputational damage as a result of impacts from this issue. Can you elaborate at all, or offer some examples of companies and some of the impacts that you've seen play out?
Yeah, sure. I mean, my recall is probably going to be a little bit imperfect on this, but some of the things that occurred to me immediately when I saw that question are, I mean, Verizon lost a contract in Germany I think it was this past summer, and a big driver of that was concern on the client side about the way Verizon may be required to share data and how it would approach that. So I think that's an example of sort of the way we're seeing that. Going back a little further, HP and Motorola have experienced some divestment campaigns based on their presence in Israel, and I don't want to get into that too deeply, but a lot of that concern is derived from their position as tech companies and companies that hold data, that have access to communications, and can impact on privacy and freedom of expression. And I mean that perhaps the classic example is the response we saw from companies following Edward Snowden's announcements. I mean, a lot of the Silicon Valley tech companies went straight to the US government and campaigned to be able to be more transparent about the data requests they were receiving. I'm actually literally going on as we speak. There's the CEO of BT Group in the United Kingdom invited investors, SRI people, myself included, to visit the company. They just released a report today on privacy and freedom of expression. And I think we can track that response back to Edward Snowden, and the fact that since then eyes are really opening up. Everybody's doing a lot of learning, and companies are trying to figure out how to make sure they are seen to be responsible stewards of privacy and freedom of expression.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Matt. We're getting some questions here about the issue of how long information is stored. I guess this is especially interesting in light of, what's been going on in Europe with Google. So I don't know. I guess I'll direct this to either Matt or Rebecca. But did you touch at all in this project on the idea of how long user information is stored and what it's used for? Beyond simply the service that it was collected for. Did you guys look at all of that? And if so, can you elaborate at all on that?
Yes, absolutely. We had an indicator that asked whether the company discloses the length of time it stores user data, and also, the purposes for which data is shared. So that's absolutely part of the index. Wanting clear disclosure about that.
Okay.
And I could point you to yeah. So it's actually indicator P7 specifically is the it asks about retention of user information and whether the company discloses how long it retains information.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying, Rebecca. I have another question here. It pertains explicitly to Google. And again, I might direct this either to Matt or to Rebecca, but the idea is, given the size of Google and really its presence in the market, would there be a number one issue for you around freedom of expression and privacy that you think investors ought to be engaging Google on?
Well, definitely some of the areas where Google had low scores are very ripe for engagement. So in particular, the indicator that I was showing earlier in terms of Google's disclosure about if and how it shares user information with third parties, it scored quite badly on that. It's not clear enough about how it's sharing information with third parties, and that's something that's very important to stakeholders. Also, to the extent that users have control over what is shared, is that information clear? Google again did not come first on the question that the other participant was asking about retention of user information. Google could be disclosing much more clearly about that. Its disclosure about how it collects user information from other parties on the web, its disclosure there is very bad. So there are a lot of consumer privacy related disclosures in particular that Google has not done especially well on and could do much better on.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rebecca. I'm just going to give listeners another moment or two to submit additional questions because we've exhausted the questions, and I realize we have a few more minutes, so we'll just give everyone a couple more moments if they'd like to submit any more questions. Otherwise, I might turn to some forward-looking questions about the project and the index. So maybe what we'll do is we'll turn to those questions now, and if any other questions trickle in, we can address them. But as we are approaching the end of the webinar, Rebecca, I guess this would be best directed to you. What do you see as the next steps for the Corporate Accountability Index?
Well, in an ideal world, we'd like to be able to cover quite a few more companies. I think some of the, as I've been going around speaking about this and fielding questions from people, the number one question is, you know, why don't you include a bunch more companies? And generally people have specific ones that they wish we had included. So that's a big one. That obviously depends on resources, and the reason we only had 16 companies had to do with the fact that that's all that our resources made possible. Um, you know, just to be honest, our main challenge going forward is even having the resources to do a second index. At the moment, we're not yet funded to actually issue a second index even with 16 companies. So we're working very hard on fundraising. And so if anybody out there on the webinar has any thoughts about that, we would certainly welcome it. We're not taking money from any of the companies we might potentially rank or are ranking, given that this is meant to be independent. So, but also in terms of next steps, there are a lot of civil society groups in many parts of the world that are actually quite interested in taking our methodology and applying it at the national or regional level. So there's somebody in India who wants to take it and apply it to a set of Indian companies that, you know, we're unlikely to ever be able to cover, you know, at our global level. You know, there's people in Latin America talking about doing a Latin America specific index that uses our methodology, and because our methodology is public, people can do that, and we welcome that. We're also trying to find resources to translate our index and findings into a few other languages, so again it'll be more accessible to more stakeholders around the world. And there are a number of groups, NGOs, civil society groups that are talking to us about advocacy strategies. There are some groups that are talking about shareholder action as well, potentially crafting shareholder resolutions or letters to CEOs as shareholders about some of the findings. So we're, you know, hearing from people about that, because we ourselves are not resourced to conduct a lot of advocacy ourselves. We're hoping to partner with other groups that whose kind of purpose and focus is to do advocacy and to provide them with the information from the index so that they can do that advocacy work. And we're also talking to a lot of policymakers. The UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, which is tied into the Human Rights Council system in the UN, he is starting a project to examine companies' practices that affect freedom of expression around the world, and he and his staff are looking very closely at our indicators. There's been a few other UN agencies that have been looking at what we're doing, because we're building on international human rights norms, we're building on the UN guiding principles for business and human rights, so we're working with various, you know, kind of global institutions and processes that are working on business and human rights standards to support the development, you know, beyond just our index, to hopefully you know, in the hopes that you know, various international bodies find the standards that we're putting forth useful in their broader work when it comes to how do you hold companies accountable, but also how do you devise regulation that's actually compatible with corporate respect for business and human rights, because one of the challenges we've seen with our data and through our research is that there are a number of companies whose scores are lower, you know, lower than they might otherwise be, because the regulations of their home country or in countries where they're primarily doing business are actually not compatible with respect for privacy and freedom of expression, or the regulations prevent the companies from being transparent about how they're handling government requests, or the regulations. There are a number of countries where, because so if you take MTN, which is a South Africa headquartered telecommunications company that we looked at, that's operating all over Africa, the Middle East, and some other places, South Africa hasn't actually, they have some data protection law that hasn't really been implemented yet, and because the law hasn't been implemented, the company hasn't really bothered to disclose much about its data collection practices. And so I think there's a lot of policy advocacy to be done as well to get laws to kind of push companies to be more transparent, but also to reform laws that are preventing companies from being accountable about freedom of expression and privacy online. And that's not to say, again, this index is not taking the position that you can't have surveillance or you can't have any controls over content. We're just saying it needs to be done accountably, and there needs to be transparency about it, and that companies need to be allowed to be transparent. And we're also hoping that governments themselves will be accountable and transparent about the laws they're enacting that place restriction on speech online, and that enable authorities to surveil content. We want to make sure that that's done in a way that's accountable and that people understand what the governments are demanding of the companies.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you very much. And I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question, because I know we're almost out of time, but we've had one more question come in, and it builds off of your response. Have you considered the opportunity for investors to support the initiative in the same way that they can sign on to other sorts of initiatives, such as access to medicine? Is that a possibility for the future?
Sure, I'd love to explore how that might work in terms of what signing on entails, whether it means sort of endorsement by specific investors or some other form of support. We're certainly very happy to work with investors to help investors use the data that we produce. So absolutely, we should definitely explore that.
Excellent. Great. Well, thank you very much. And I am conscious of time here, and we're just at the end. So with that in mind, I'd like to conclude today's webinar, and I'd like to thank once again Rebecca MacKinnon and Matt Barg for taking time out of their busy schedules to answer our questions and present findings from the index. I found it a truly fascinating discussion, so thanks very much. And again, as we mentioned at the beginning, we will be sending out a recording of today's webinar to all participants. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.